Hello everyone and welcome back to another automation guide. Today we'll be doing the American 1990s. And this era is where you'll see a lot more modern, of course, cars with contemporary stuff. A lot more technology. Cars are more familiar nowadays. Or in this decade compared to nowadays, instead of it being like all random and weird. It's a little bit more uniform. See here. Body style, anything object, anything round, no corners, no squares, no nothing, nothing square, all round. Anything you see round without like a corner, just use that. Like anything round without a corner, object and arrow and whatnot. Panel material. Treated steel is being used to further combat anti-corrosion, but it's technically been a thing since the 1970s. Yes, as this treated steel is what was it? Pass through a series of bath clean and pass through anti-rust. Yeah, because this has like a full treatment compared to before, where it was just kind of maybe a chemical in there. This has a full treatment now. Is the difference. Um, Aluminum and partial aluminum, I wouldn't say was a thing yet. Like European cars do use like a partial aluminum, full aluminum, but not American cars. There's not something like that in the 90s yet. Partial carbon fiber, full, no, of course not. Chassis type, full monocoque, full unibody. Any new car is now made with a unibody. No ladder frames. Those are all the old fleet cars. So it's all unibody. Chassis material, galvanized steel is still being used. And corrosion resistant, maybe on luxury. Yeah, because Japanese cars started to use it on the 80s in corrosion resistant steel, and so now American like luxury cars kind of use them in the 90s. Engine placements are now all front transverses. You don't. There's no front longitudinals. Those are the old fleets, but now it's all front transverse, front wheel drive, etc. And front suspension is still McPherson strut. I still can't find anything on double wishbones because double wishbones are like just expensive to make compared to McPherson's. They're just about they do the same job but cheaper, basically. Rear suspension, you actually have fully independent now with the front wheel drive. You don't have torsion beams anymore either. It's fully independent with semi trailing arms just being the default. Double wishbones were used, but it was like performance cars, maybe sport sedans, sport coupes, something like that. Maybe just sporty compact. And multi-links, I don't think American cars had multi-links in the 90s yet. I saw Japanese and European, like, big luxury cars use multi-link, but I don't think American cars. It's like double wishbone, air suspension, etc. Push rod, of course, nothing like that. For the engines, inline fours and V6s and V8s were dying in this area because you can't fit big of an engine in a small transverse engine compartment. But Cadillac did with the North Star and Lincoln with their modular V8s, and they put dual overhead cams in them for a Lincoln. They did those are the two cars with the transverse V8s, but those are like the only decade I think they did this in. See here. Block material, cast iron. Block or head material could be cast iron or aluminum because this is the 90s and they started using aluminum in just about everything. This is a bad example. Yeah, there we go. Fixed it. Yeah, they started using aluminum in one part of the engine or another because they could have full cast iron in something like a shared truck engine, but usually if it was like in a regular passenger car, it was cast iron or aluminum. See here. Cranks, cast irons. I think I've seen some cars used forged, believe it or not. I think it was like one or two, but they're not as much. Conrods, cast irons, pistons, hypertectic cast. And I forgot to mention this last episode, but or no, yeah, well, yeah. In inline fours, there is a balance shaft, and really Chrysler experimented with the balance shaft in the '80s, and they really kind of perfected it in the '90s. As a lot more inline fours in the '90s started to use balance shafts. So I'd say just full on start to use balance shafts very heavy now for inline fours, even if you got a small 2 liter to a big 2.5 liter, Um, Tuning. This is probably the last era of modest horsepower. Inline fours I'll make almost as much as they can. And oh my gosh, I forgot about because of the heads and valves, which I completely forgot to go over. I'm stupid. Uh, Most new engines saw single overhead cam, 2-valve design. Usually V engines got that, and dual overhead cam 4-valve designs came from existing ones from Japan's, but some Fords did have it in the late '90s. Yeah, like the Ford Zetec engine. That was one of the inline fours with dual overhead cams. I don't remember if that was the Ford Cologne plant made that, but it was still used in American cars, so it's an inline four dual overhead cam, 4 valves, but mainly keep it 2 valves overhead cam if you're making it V. And that's why the tuning is a lot more, because with instead of push rods, you have overhead cams, and they can make a lot more performance. They breathe a lot easier, and you can just get them a lot more efficient, So with that, you actually make pretty good horsepower. 183 horsepower is still, I think, a little low for 3.4 liter, but also in this era, manufacturers started to have a lot of special stuff, like GM with the Vortex. It had like a Vortex intake that helped with the airflow. Ford's, like I mentioned, Zetec engine, it had something special with it. What was it? I forgot about that. But yeah, the engine started to have something special in them. And that's how they made more horsepower than you could, because you could just make a basic engine and automation compared to something that's like Ecotech Boost Ford does. So if you think you're not making as much horsepower, that's fine. Your car's still gonna be good. Carburetors, no more carburetors. The last carbureted car was the '91 LTD Crown Vic Police variant, and that wasn't even sold to the public, because that as the last actual one, I think, was 1990 on some sort of SUV. It was 90. I forget which one, but carburetors, they were not a thing. Injection and even throttle bodies, as you can see, they were being replaced by full multi-point by the mid 1990s. So throttle bodies were even being phased out by the mid 90s, and that's why there's a '94 engine multi-point. So it was very, very modern with multi-point. Very fast getting to multi-point from just regular single throttle bodies. Single throttle body standard. Variable could be found now. Chrysler, Ford, and GM all had one in V6. Yeah. They all had some sort of variable V6, which is this manifold variable. Still single configurations. And of course, like I said, variable manifolds could be found. I just don't have one here because I guess this is like a standard V6. If they had a regular V6, there were still those. Variables were more performance model orientated and whatnot. Regular 86 AKI for regular, 89 AKI regular plus, and 91. It was like 86, 87, I think, 89, 91, and 93. All those fuels were actually starting to be used, but of course 86 was still being the regular de facto. Hitters, cast mid, tubular for performance, but this isn't performance, it's just regular cast. Single or dual. Catalytic converters, of course, 3-way. I couldn't find much about a high flow three-way, but I found one that like a 94 Ford Mustang, the SN94 Mustangs, they had those. They had a high flow three-way from the factory, so it's like probably not. First and second mufflers were actually, or first mufflers were actually now standard on every engine. Because back before, you had like an inline four or a cheap six-cylinder. It didn't have a first muffler. Now, no matter what engine, it's a first and second muffler. Every engine now does. And that's it for engines, I guess so. My cat's biting me. Distracting me. See here. Design. One design I can tell you is, of course, plastic was in. As this bumper would be plastic, there'd be these plastic things, the trim, and of course, all of the like headlights, taillights, mirrors, everything would be round. There's not a square inside, corner in sight. This is like the most corner you would get in a car, but that's because of just how the thing is. You could probably find more on, what do you call it, the workshop that's actually round and doesn't have any points like this, but you get it. I already kind of hammered it in. Blob, round. Gearbox, front wheel drives, of course, it's a transverse. Rear wheel drive, it's gone with no transverse. All wheel drives, American cars still didn't use all wheel drive systems. The really only ones that were using them was something like Eagle. Let me think here. I think so. I think that was just about the only one that had all-wheel drive. And even if they had all-wheel drive, I think it was more or less a helical thing, because with all-wheel drive, you usually have the viscous LSD or regular LSD or something like that. But just keep it front-wheel drive. There's no all-wheel drive yet. Gearbox, 4-speed automatics were quickly becoming the base transmissions, with 5-speed manuals becoming standard on economy in base cars. And 5 speeds you could actually still find a 5-speed on like the last cars that were used manuals, even like on a Subaru, like 2019, 2020 Subaru Impreza, 5-speed. 6 speeds coming in the mid-90s on performance cars. You could on American performance cars. Yes, other companies were using 6 speeds before the mid-90s, but American cars had mid-90s. And 4-speed manuals were rare. There was like 1 or 2 cars that had a 4-speed manual, but they were mostly automatics. Final drives never went over 4 and never went under 3.25, depending on your horsepower. Of course, with this gearing setup, I'd say really just something like this would be good. 4 speeds did 4-speed automatics, or advanced automatics, I should say, were something like this. They had an overdrive like the 4L, like the 4L60E or 4L80E. It had an overdrive like this. Some automatics did, some automatics didn't. I think there was the Ford overdrive, that's an automatic. What was Chrysler's 4-speed? I forgot, but they usually had overdrives. 5 and 6-speed manuals usually had overdrives as well. So really, you just had an overdrive on just about everything there was. And of course, spacing is very different depending on the company. I recommend using the easy option, the basic option, or just looking it up themselves, because really the only way you're going to know gearing is if you've like geared stuff on a racing game. And it's a little so basic mode's there for that. Tire types. Of course, open differential. Radials de facto. Alloys rims were optional and even standard on the late 90s. As their steel was still being used, like 94, steel would still be used, but alloys, it'd probably be alloys much later. Especially optional alloys are still kind of a thing, but mainly it's just steel. Sidewall starting around 60 profile, steel rim starting around 16-inch. Of course, modern tire sizes because they're radials. 195 60 R16s. You know, that's a real tire you can actually get. That might be a little thin because it's like 205s, but you make your tire, but just keep it 60 sidewalls, probably 16-inch rims. Front vented single pistons, default, of course. They actually started last decade, but of course that's still default this decade. Drums still being standard on the rim on some cars. Some bigger and premium cars have four-wheel discs as standard. Just about every car had optional four-wheel discs. Yeah. SUVs, like the brand new Explorer at the time, it actually had four-wheel discs. And I think even Buicks and whatnot had four-wheel discs. So just keep that in mind. It's like a premium car would have discs. I had drums on here at first, but they sucked. I put discs and they were much better because this car company I made is like a premium, like along with Buick and them. Aerodynamics, I don't. There were still no under trays. I know it's that long. There's still no under trays. There might be like a little wing on here if the car is fast enough in like a little package, but that says like as long as it can because it was like a little aero packages. These are started in the 90s or 2000s because you'd see cars that were first made in the 90s and then went on to the 2000s and they have that like a little wing spoiler aero package and that had a little lip like that on the back, you know. So I'd say just keep that in mind. Rear bench and front buckets was now standard, with the only cars having big benches were big luxury cars like the Roadmaster, of course, because that was sort of a traditional station wagon, and that was the only thing that had front and rear benches. So now you got 2 buckets, 3 bench. Yeah, that's standard for every car now. No, it's not an option to get a bench anymore or buckets. It's still just yeah. Of course, interiors, and for entertainment, CD players were becoming standard by the mid-late 90s. Like you could get a CD player, or you could get a cassette. It's usually it depends. It's like a late 90s. Usually cassettes were optional, but by mid 90s it was like cassettes were just standard. Cassettes were still standard. Let's see here. This decade saw power steering standard on just about every car, with the exception of some subcompacts. Yeah. What the oh, not the CRX. That's Japanese. I don't know. I think maybe American cars did just have power steering even on subcompacts. But I'd say just every car had rack and pinion steering. Variable hydraulic, I didn't mention that. Some cars did. Some big heavy cars did have variable hydraulics, but not many. I think it was a GM car because of course GM was GM money. ABS was being standardized in this decade and an option. Still an option, but ABS was being standardized on just regular cars. And Saturn in the 90s had even traction control, yes. But I don't think an American manufacturer had ESC, though. There was still no stability control, either anti-lock brakes, and of course that one, traction control. Of course, standard safety. Something like this, yeah. According to this, standard twin tube and passive is still a very common setup even in the 1990s. Something like that. That was still being common. There was still just a regular suspension. Like if you just wanted a base economy car, that's the suspension for you. It's cheapest, no electronics, no nothing, just your springs, your dampers, and your sway bars. Of course, progressives were being kind of standardized now too. It depends on like luxury cars, of course, used progressives. They were being used not just for heavy duty. Active sport and comfort. I don't think I found a car in American car in the 90s that used an active suspension. In the 2000s, they had that, but not in the 90s. For dampers, like I said, twin tube still de facto. Gas monotubes were a little not as used, because if you use something, it would be an adaptive damper system that, you could switch from comfort to sport. Those were just used in, what were they? Premium and luxury vehicles outside of just that, because like a Cadillac, they had something like that. Buicks did too, I'm pretty sure. High end stuff, other than just performance cars. And like I said, if it had adaptive or gas monotube, it would have adaptive. Semi-active dampers or semi-active sway bars were still not used, because that kind of works with the active sport comforts. Or, no, I don't think you can actually use those. Yeah, you can. So yeah, semi-active is still electronics, and not as many electronics are still used. Just keep that in mind, because as technologically impressive as the 90s jumped from the 80s to 90s, it was still modest, I guess you could say. Cars are now stiff but still soft, and I think they cause that a European feel. Yeah, because, of course, that's watching Motor Week, which was like my main place of research. They mentioned the European drive in so many American cars, which, and of course, that just was, it was a sporty but comfortable feel. I'd say maybe something like that. Maybe a little stiffer here, but the dampers were still very soft. Full independent suspension came front and rear sway bars. Yes, front and rear sway bars, of course. Very good, very rigid, and maybe a little bit lower roll angle. And 1 to 2 inches above minimum ride height, because, of course, yeah, that actually might be a little low, because you'd still want your cars high for plenty of space and cargo suspension and whatnot. Something that low would be in a sports package. This would just be in the regular car. And that's it. Yeah, that's it. All right. Well, thanks for watching this video if you made it all the way through. And of course, the guide is in the description if you want it. So I'll see you next time.